Hey, how's everyone doing today? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the IE600 by Sennheiser. So yeah, without further ado, let's talk about the build, cable, and fit, and then we'll get into the sound aspects. So yeah, the cable is not that great. It is kind of like microphonic. And if you move around a lot, it does cause issues. The quality of the cable is pretty not that great. As you can see, it twirls and tingles a lot. So yeah, that's the cable. There aren't really that many good replacement cables for it. So yeah, it is what it is. And now let's talk about the build quality. So this is one of the most well-built IEMs I've ever put my hands on. It has this like textured finish and it feels really premium. And the shell size of this IEM is extremely small. This is one of the smallest IEMs I've ever used, other than maybe the ER4SR and ER2SE. So yeah, that's the build quality. Really good. I would give it probably full marks for build quality. It's light, but it feels extremely premium. So yeah, that's the build. Now let's talk about the fit. So this fits flawlessly in my ear because it's so small. And once you put it in your ear, you're not even going to feel it. It's that good. Very good fit. I would say it's way above average compared to almost any IEM I've ever used. And I never got any fatigue or comfort issues. So yeah, it just, like when you touch it, it just has this really nice feel. It's like, it's not like very smooth, but it has like this feeling to it. It's hard to explain. But yeah, really good build and fit. So they hit a home run in the build and fit department. So yeah, now let's talk about the bass. So you do see that this IEM has a 15 dB bass boost, but honestly it does not sound like that because I feel like the driver is smaller. That's why they added more of a boost in the bass. So in terms of hearing, it sounds like it has like a 5 to 7 dB boost in the bass. So this is why you can't just look at the chart and say, oh, it has 15 dB bass boost, whatever. It does not sound like that. There's no way it sounds like a 15 dB bass boost. So yeah, I would say the bass is very good. It's punchy. It's rumbly. The bass isn't that much. So if you are a bass head, I still don't think this is gonna be good for a bass head because the bass amount is simply not enough. But in terms of the bass quality, it's very detailed. You do pick up the way the track was recorded, and when you listen to songs that don't have too much bass, that's where you could tell the quality of the bass is spectacular, because the bass on tracks that shouldn't have bass, it's tight and it's not going to be that boomy. So you get a really good bass. Yeah, I don't have any issues with the bass. It pops up pretty perfectly. And the texture of the bass is really good. It doesn't compete with some more expensive IEMs, but for the price, I'd say the bass quality sounds phenomenal. It's tight, never woolly, never like a bad texture by any means. So the bass is very good. It's just punchy, rumbly, controlled. So yeah, really good bass. I have no issues with the bass. And for a 7mm, I feel like this has ample amounts of bass. So yeah, now let's talk about the mid-range. So the mid-range is very natural on this. When I was first listening to it, it just sounded like it was neutral, like neutral voicing. It wasn't too emphasized. It wasn't really recessed. So I would say the mid-range is very present. And one thing I did notice, so when you have a balanced armature, you're going to notice it sounds more separated. But on a dynamic driver, it sounds more natural and realistic in a way, where it's not overly separating. So yeah, in terms of like the instrument separation, when you listen to percussions, when you listen to busy tracks with a lot of instruments, this is a phenomenal job. The timbre in the mid-range is spot on. Really good mid-range. So it's not, the mid-range isn't as forward as some Harman tuned IEMs. But to me, the mid-range just sounded neutral. So when you listen to cymbal strikes, when you listen to saxophones, when you listen to voices, male or female, to me it just sounded neutral in the mid-range, not overly emphasized, not too recessed, just neutral is how I would say how the mid-range sounded. So I wouldn't say this is a V-shaped IEM, because in terms of actual hearing, it's U-shaped, because the mid-range is always present. You don't have to crank up the volume to get more of a mid-range. So yeah, really good. The only thing I could say is I wish the mid-range was a little more forward, and the separation was better in terms of how open it sounds. We'll get into that when we talk about the technical aspects and what I noticed. This IEM got me a little confused because I'm used to listening to dynamic driver sets, but we'll get into that later. It's an interesting thing that I found out. So yeah, let's talk about the treble now. So this does have a few peaks, I guess, in the treble, or boost in the treble in the 7, 8K and 9K region. So if you're treble sensitive and if you can't tolerate too much treble, I would stay away from these, because it is boosted in the treble. And for someone who's not used to that type of treble boost, I could see how it could get fatiguing. But for me, I got no fatigue from it. It was on the spicier side, but it never hurt my ears. So the treble is a little distracting to me because it's boosted, so on certain tracks it's gonna sound different than on any other IEM because of the way it punctuates micro details. Little things just pop out like in a really nice manner, but on other tracks that could be a little distracting because the treble is extremely spicy. And then that's just the 7, 8K, and 9K region. And then the air above 10K, it is present. It doesn't go to 20K or anything, but this IEM has ample amounts of air. So when you listen to vocal nuances and inflections, this pops up in a pretty nice manner. So out of the bass, mids, and highs, I would say the strong point of this IEM is probably the mid-range. This does an excellent job in the mid-range. And yeah, the mid-range, I wouldn't say this IEM is excellent in a particular thing. It just sounds neutral across the board. It doesn't sound that bass boosted as the chart would suggest. Even on songs that are really bassy, I never thought that the bass was out of control or too much. And I am sensitive to weird bass sounds, like if there's too much mid bass or too much sub bass, that could be an issue to me. But I think because of the size of this driver, I do agree with the tuning that they use. Because when you have a smaller driver, you might need to boost the bass, which totally makes sense. So I do agree with the tuning. I do wish the highs were a little calmer and there was more air above 10K instead of having more treble at 7, 8, or 9K. Yeah, so that's what I thought. So now let's talk about the soundstage. So I noticed this when you listen to a balanced armature unit, everything is way more spread out. Basically, when you listen to a balanced armature, you get a more open sound, but this isn't as open. Yeah, so it's more closed in, but in terms of where everything is placed, it's very well defined. So let's say the soundstage on this IM is this big, where balanced armature might be a little wider and more open sounding. But in terms of the details you pick up in that smaller stage is exceptional. It's very, very detailed. So yeah, that's how the soundstage works on a dynamic driver, in my opinion. It's going to be more closed in, but it's going to be very well defined. And then onto the imaging. This has really, really good imaging because it doesn't have any coherency issues. And the imaging is close to like 90% there. Very, very good imaging. It's almost pinpoint. So for the price, it's well above average for the imaging that I've ever heard. It's not as pinpoint as like an IERM9 or maybe the U12T. But again, those IEMs cost way more. So in terms of the imaging, I do think it's 90% there in terms of being pinpoint where everything is. And now let's talk about the technical performance. So this IE600 just hits a home run in the technical performance aspect. It has a lot of detail, like very detailed. Yeah, I'd give it's slightly behind the IEM9, but under 1,000, this is probably the most detailed IEM I've ever heard. This is more resolving than some IEMs that have 4 or 5 balanced armature units. Yeah, so it's just very, very detailed. I don't know how they pulled that off because I heard a lot of dynamic drivers and the technical performance is always not that great on dynamic drivers. But Sennheiser somehow hit a home run with this IEM. So yeah, I'm going to talk about reverb and then I'm going to talk about comparisons with a few other IEMs. So I do feel like this has like a reverb chamber built in it when I'm listening to songs. And it kind of reminded me of the IERM9 and the U12T because what good manufacturers should use is not use sound tubes. Because when you use a tube, it's not going to sound as open or airy. Like that sense of that like echoey reverb effect, which the IERM9 and U12T do an excellent job of. It's almost like the space of the song slows down. So I do think the chamber that they made for this around the driver, it's like a speaker, like a enclosure of a speaker with the way it sounds where there's no tubes, it's just free flowing in a chamber. So this IM does have a little bit of that reverb going on. Obviously, the U12T has the most amount of reverb I've ever heard in an IEM, but and then the IEM9 would be in second place, but this would be in third place. And most IEMs don't have reverb, but this IEM does have that. So that's amazing for an IEM in this price point to have reverb. Yeah, really good. So now let's make some comparisons. Let's start off with the variations and the Helios, and then we'll talk about the U12T and IEM9. So the variations will have a sense of an open soundstage. Let's say if the variation sounds more open, like open, this one's gonna sound more smaller. However, in that soundstage, the details come up better on the IE600. So hopefully you guys understand what I'm saying. So the soundstage is smaller on the IE600, but the details are more. Now let's talk about the imaging. So the IE600 just images better than the variations. That's just, I'm not sure how. Maybe because it's more coherent and it has one driver. Yeah, so IE600 images better. Yeah, so the variations in the Helios are more neutral. This has spicier treble. And then bass, the variation has more bouncy bass. So if you like bass, sub bass, the variation is better for that. The mid-range, again, the variation sounds pretty neutral. You get a right amount of upper mid-range. But the variations could sound thin for some male voices. Where on the IE600, I never found it to be thin for male voices. Yeah, treble, I would say the variations again is more neutral. This is spicier. And then the Helios, the IE600 just blows the Helios out of the water in terms of the imaging. Because, again, it's more coherent. I could, when an instrument is playing in turn, it's more evident on the IE600. And then the soundstage, the Helios will sound a little more open again. But this IEM on the IE600, the soundstage is smaller. But again, the definition in that smaller soundstage is much better than the Helios. Yeah, so technical performance-wise, the IE600 just runs circles around the Helios and the variations. The IE600 is just more detailed than both of these IEMs. And that's kind of weird because this is only one driver. This is using, I believe, 4 or 5, and this is using 5. So Sennheiser is really stepping their game up. Because when you use one driver and you can do performance that beats out, this costs like a little over $1,000. And the IE600 has more detail than the Helios. So it's kind of crazy. So in terms of like sounds, like the height and depth, the Helios does not have good right-left depth. It sounds kind of mushed in with more height. Where on the IE600, you get a little bit more right-left depth. Not way better, but slightly better than the Helios. And then, yeah, so that's what I noticed about the Helios. And then the variations sounds a little more open than the IE600. So yeah, those are that two. Now let's compare it to the U12T and then the IEM9. So the U12T has way more detail than the IE600. That's not really a comparison. It has better bass, better mid-range, better treble. But yeah, so like in terms of soundstage and imaging, the soundstage on the U12T sounds very open and wide. Like I said, it has that speaker reverb setup. so it doesn't really compete. The bass, I do like the bass on the U12T more, even though it's BA bass. It's just textured better. It's tighter. Yeah, really good. And then the mid-range, of course the U12T is going to do a better job in the mid-range. It has more gain in that region. The voices are more full, male or female. And the instrument separation, detailing, it's all just way better than the IE600. And now on to the IRM9. So the IRM9 has better imaging and a better sense of openness in the stage. But yeah, so like in terms of coherency, the IE600 is very coherent, obviously because it's one dynamic driver. However, the IRM9 gives the IE600 a run for its coherency actually, because this is an all BA set, but the coherency is so perfect on the IRM9, it almost sounds like it's being run by one driver. Like, it's very coherent, way more coherent than the Helios or the Variations. So I did notice when you only have one driver, the sounds are just more coherent. I don't know how, but so like when you listen to a balanced armature set, you get more separation. You hear more layers. But on a dynamic driver, it sounds like you're listening to a pair of studio monitors. Just a pair. And then the U12T or IRM9, because of the balanced armature, it sounds like you're listening to multiple speakers. So you get more height, more depth on these two. But in terms of the way micro details pop up, I still think the coherency of one driver is better than multiple drivers. With the IE600, I was listening to it and I kept thinking it's not as well separated as a balanced armature set. With multiple drivers, this actually sounds like you're listening to one driver, and then the details pop up perfectly on the IE600. So it's like an A+ for the detail, like home run. Yeah, so it's really, really good. There was one more thing I had to say. Forgot about it. Yeah, I can't think of what I was going to say. I had a note sheet, but... So yeah, like... Oh, okay. So the IE600, it won't sound like a balanced armature unit. There's no BA timbre in it. The timbre's spot on. I do wish the treble was calmer. But other than that, I haven't heard an IM that sounds like this. This actually confused me when I listened to it at first, because I wasn't used to having less separated sound in terms of the soundstage. But in a smaller soundstage, you get more detailed in some IM. So that kind of confused me because I wasn't used to that. So yeah, I would say if you can handle more treble, get the IE600. If you get fatigued easily by treble, stay away from the IE600. And if you want a single dynamic driver that has the most amount of details you've ever heard, probably under 1,000, get the IE600. It just performs. It sounds like you're listening to two speakers. It doesn't sound that open. And you don't get fleshed out full images like you would on the U12T. But for a single dynamic driver, I think this is a home run IEM. So all three of these IEMs have that reverb chamber effect, where the inside of all three of these IEMs, it's made to sound like a speaker in a box. So there's no tubes. This is a direct placement. So the speaker's right here and it shoots directly into your ear, and then there's a chamber around this. So yeah, these are the 3 IEMs that have that. So amazing. Sennheiser knocked it out of the ballpark. This works well with all genres. Like I said though, if you can't handle too much treble, then that is one thing to note. But if you can get over that treble, this IEM is an all-rounder IEM. It works with all genres. And so yeah, I'd say the tonality is probably like an A grade, but the technical performance, I would give it an A plus. It's that good, and I haven't heard an IEM that's this detailed. So for single dynamic drivers, I guess this is my favorite one now. Before this, I never heard a good dynamic driver IEM. So yeah, that's what I thought. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. I know it was a little long, but I just had to talk about it and what my findings were. So yeah, take care everyone, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.